Hey folks, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History Modern. Today we are continuing on with our Unit 5 lectures, this time looking at the impact of the Industrial Revolution. So for your bell work, I would like you to please identify 3 inventions of the Industrial Revolution. Our notes for today, the impact of the Industrial Revolution. So this is lining up with topic 5.9 in our AP course description. So that means our objective will be you will be able to explain how industrialization caused change in existing social hierarchies and standards of living. So hopefully you already have some ideas. Things we've either already talked about in class, logically, ways you can think of change, but also, again, connecting back to what you learned last year in AP Human Geography, right? We've talked a lot in that class about how societies change as they get to be more developed, that there is going to be an impact on demographics, birth rates, death rates. It's going to have an impact on education, on the distribution of wealth, on the exploitation of raw materials in the environment. So hopefully this is all ringing a bell to you, and you are going to be able to connect your prior knowledge to what we are learning about in this specific historical time frame. One of the biggest changes that the Industrial Revolution will bring about in terms of population distribution will be the growth of these industrial cities. So our population density is still very low, right? We looked at graphs in a previous lecture, seeing how demographics will change so dramatically, how birth rates will not so much skyrocket, but the infant mortality rate will drop so precipitously that it will cause the population growth to skyrocket. So prior to this time in history, most people were living in rural settlements, right? You have a few big cities, London, Paris, Edo, Mexico City, right? There are significant large cities. Istanbul, that's huge, right? However, most people in the world were not living in one of these big cities. Most people in the world were living in a cottage on their farm. In England specifically, we start to see that cities grow like crazy. Small towns will grow and merge until you have a megalopolis. Think about like the greater London area, right? It used to be London and then lots of small villages around it. Now, when we say London, it encompasses all of that. We talk about the London metro area. Just like with New York, you might have talked about Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx as separate cities. But of course, as they've grown and overlapped, when we talk about New York City, we are talking about all of the 5 boroughs together. So, wealth will go into the building of new homes, churches, museums, and theaters in the wealthy parts of town, right? If you are a wealthy industrialist, you want to demonstrate how rich you are. What's the best way to do that? Well, I'm going to endow this theater. I'm going to give all this money to this museum, right? It's kind of like how in the Renaissance, you had all of these Italian merchants who were making tons of money, wanting to demonstrate how rich they are. So they're buying all this Renaissance art. They're patrons of the Renaissance. In this day and age, they are investing in architecture. They are investing in museums and parks. But of course, this is only going to be in the wealthy neighborhoods. In our poor neighborhoods, you find lots of recent migrants. Now, some of these migrants might be from other countries, but the vast majority will be from the countryside, rural to urban migration. Their homes will be cheaply made, row homes, shoddy. They are not safe. They are not up to standard. And so, of course, there's going to be all these environmental problems, right? You have overcrowding in these terribly made homes. You have no sewer system. So what do? You throw your sewage and trash into the streets, into the gutters, right? You might think about like, oh, get your mind out of the gutter. Well, nowadays, when we look at the gutter, it has like some leaves and maybe some, cigarette butts in it. Gutters used to be full of literal human and animal excrement, of the bones and leftover bits from cooking. It's what you had before you had sewer systems, before you had indoor plumbing. You would see that people would still be living side by side with animals. It would be common to have goats and pigs and chickens wandering through the streets. You might have your animals sleep with you in your house. Pollution was terrible. The London fog you may have heard about infamously, it really was so dense and polluted that you could hold your arm out in front of you and not see your hand on some days. This is primarily because of all of the burning of coal from the factories and homes. It doesn't help that at this time, the predominant medical theory in terms of how diseases spread was known as the miasma theory. Now, this is not something that you'll ever be asked about on the AP test, but you might find it interesting. So the miasma theory basically said that we get sick because of bad air, right? Which is not terribly wrong, but this is before we knew about germs. We didn't know that there was tiny organisms, whether bacterial or those strange alien things that are viruses. So how is it that, your neighbor can get sick and then you get sick and then the person beside you gets sick, or all the kids in a school get sick? What do they all have in common? Well, they all breathe the same air, right? So the miasma theory says that you're breathing in bad air. So how do you know if the air is bad or good? Well, if it smells bad, it's obviously bad. So again, they're not completely wrong. Air pollution is going to be terribly damaging to the lungs. It will weaken your immune system and all of that jazz. But now we understand germ theory. One of the things that they're going to see in London with this terrible health outbreak, so many diseases, they are going to attribute this to the air pollution, to the bad air. To the bad smells coming off the Thames, to the, smoke and fog coming out of the factories. So the wealthy, of course, when the London fog, when the air pollution gets really bad, they will flee to the countryside. And again, in many ways, this reaffirms the miasma theory, because as soon as you get out of that bad air, you get to the countryside, to a more isolated location with fresh air, you get better or you don't get sick. Well, we understand now, of course, that they have just removed themselves from the presence of the germs. It's not that the clean air is what makes them well. It's that they aren't close to the contaminants. So there's all these environmental problems. There's literal sewage in the streets. It is running into the rivers. So the rivers, which is where you get your water from, right, is contaminated by sewage as well as industrial runoff. You have railroads going into the heart of the city, which is amazing in terms of distributing goods, in terms of economic growth. This is huge, but it brings noise and pollution to the center of cities for the first time. And then, of course, like I was saying, you have lots of diseases. Right? You have all of your normal diseases at this time, influenza, smallpox, but you have new ones as well. Rickets. Rickets is going to be a huge one. Rickets is caused by a lack of vitamin D, specifically a lack of sunshine. So when you have these children and these adults, but especially kids, growing up in factories, growing up in London, where they spend all their time indoors working, or when they are outside, it's foggy and gross, so they don't get any direct sunlight, it will cause rickets. And with a lack of vitamin D, it means your muscles and bones don't develop correctly. You see a growth in cholera. So cholera is a disease that is still rampant today. It's still hugely problematic. Cholera is spread through water. And the way it works is essentially it kills you through dehydration. Essentially, you drink water that has been contaminated by human waste, by fecal matter, and it makes you sick. And so you barf and have diarrhea until you get so dehydrated that you die. But of course, all your barfing and pooping has meant that cholera, your diseased waste, has gone into the water supply. And so when more people drink the water, they will get sick as well. Cholera will kill hundreds of thousands. In fact, let's see, do I have something about it? No, I don't. Dr. John Snow, is going to be the first one to identify water as the source of the cholera epidemic in London, as opposed to air. And he's going to come forward with his ideas, and everyone's going to laugh him out of the room. They're going to be like, really, John Snow? You know nothing. And he's going to be like, fine, tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you that I'm right. So he, without authority, goes into this poor neighborhood where everyone's literally dying of cholera, and he takes away the handle to the water pump that he believes is contaminated, meaning that people can no longer get water from this pump, and they're going to be forced to go to other sources, and those people don't get sick because they're not drinking the contaminated water. It's a great feat of geography. Honestly, he maps out it's contact tracing. He talks to the people who are sick. He talks to their loved ones if they have died. He maps out where they live. He figures out what do they all have in common. What they all have in common is that they got water from the same well. All right, what about economic impacts? Well, you have the birth of things like insurance companies for the first time, right? Because you have people investing, you want some insurance. So you have the growth of the insurance industry. You have the emergence of stock markets for the first time, where you can invest in a company. And in general, around the world, they are using something known as the gold standard, which means that all paper money, everything is backed up against the value of gold. So between 1860 and 1873, so 13 years, corporations in Europe doubled. You also start to see the emergence of these transnational companies like the United Fruit Company or Hong Kong Banking Corporation. Some of these companies still exist today, and you may recognize them. All of this will be supported by laissez-faire economics, right? Adam Smith's ideas, as well as economic liberalism, which were some of the ideas of John Stuart Mill. Both really encourage a lack of government intervention into the market. As railroads and canals are constructed and roads, it will link cities throughout Europe, increasing the diffusion of goods. So, the Industrial Revolution starts in Britain, but by the 1820s, France, Belgium, the US, and Germany are starting to industrialize. Continental Europe will be forced to take a step backwards because of the 1848 revolutions. The United States, the industrialization is not even, so the North is industrializing while the South is staying predominantly agrarian. It's one of the things that contributes to tensions leading to the American Civil War, and the industrial North's ability to move goods from place to place as well as manufacture them effectively is one of the things that will lead to the North's victory over the South. By the end of the 19th century, the 1800s, you will see Japan, Egypt, and Russia all beginning to industrialize as well. So, what about the rural environment? Well, the fact of the matter is, even prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was almost no wilderness left in the UK, and frankly, very little left in Europe, right? This is one of the things that makes the United States so distinctly different from Europe. Europe has been populated for such a long time, and its population density has always been relatively high for its territory. And so the land has been developed. Remember, we talked about in the medieval period, deforestation, increased mining. So the demand for natural raw materials has shifted. And the way we see the natural environment being impacted is predominantly with new transportation infrastructure. We have new roads being built. We have canals being built, railroads being built. So this will change the nature of the natural environment as mountains have holes blasted through them. So you can take a train through the Alps. As waterways are reconfigured to build canals and dams. So this totally aligns with the AP theme, interactions with the environment. And then, of course, if we look at the working conditions are pretty brutal. Factory work was frankly repetitive and terribly, terribly boring. You did not require any skills to do it successfully. And it was things like just, putting one piece into another, day in and day out for hours on end. I mean, think about that. Imagine if your job was to, nail in two things as it came in front of you. That's all you do all day. You're not allowed to talk to your neighbor. You didn't have any breaks. You didn't have music to listen to. You didn't have a podcast to listen to or an audiobook. All you did all day was sit there in silence and nail the same two things down again and again. The creation of gas lighting, so you have natural gas being piped into the building, and then you light that, will allow for the working day to continue past sunset. Right? Before the Industrial Revolution, you basically worked from sunrise to sunset because that's all you had light for. Long hours, few breaks, and accidents were common and could ruin a factory. So industrialists valued their machines and their factories over their workers. There's an accident and, oh no, you lost your hand. Oh gosh, well, that's too bad. How's the machine? Is it okay? Oh, good, it is. Well, we can get a new worker. You're fired, by the way, because you can't do this job with one hand. There's no OSHA, right? There's no oversight into safety procedures. There's no insurance. There's no control over tools or jobs or working hours. So you have the emergence of this new social class, factory workers. Before, you basically had the wealthy and poor farmers, right? And I guess you could sort of say merchants are this mid-level, right? So you're either a poor farmer, maybe you're a merchant, or you're a wealthy aristocrat. Now you have this working class emerge, right? Who are less educated and less wealthy than those involved in trade, but who are distinctly different in how they spend their time, their level of wealth, their living standards are all very different from that of a poor peasant, right? Of a poor farmer. So this new social class, this industrial working class, has to put up with dangerous conditions for working. For example, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire happened in New York. And it's often used as an example. Basically, you have all these women working, sewing shirts in this factory. and they were locked into their room on the upper floor of this building because the foreman thought that they were taking too many breaks to, use the restroom, things like that. And so when a fire breaks out, they don't have any way to escape. There's no fire escapes, right? They're locked in. And so many of these women either burned to death or leapt out the windows to their death. And so it became this big scandal. These factory workers have to conform to the factory schedule. They don't have any voice. They don't have any way to voice their concerns about the impacts to their health. The fact that it causes them to go deaf, the impact to their lungs, the loss of limbs, the illness, right? If you work in a mine and you get black lung and you can't do the work anymore, it's not the factory's fault. It's not the company's fault that you got black lung and are dying, obviously. You're just fired because you can't do the work. And why should I pay you if you're not doing the work? Even though it was the work environment that caused you to be in this health situation. Child labor is going to be common at first, and there's huge wage discrepancies between the genders. Women are paid significantly less. So, women almost always worked within the family, spinning, weaving, sewing, and when women did get jobs outside the home, it would often be as domestic servants, so working as a maid in a big house, or in textile mills, working on making cloth, where they would earn about a third as much as a man would. So typically, young, unmarried women worked outside the home. The idea was once you got married, your focus would shift, right, to being a wife and a mother. And so you obviously couldn't do both. You couldn't work outside the home and be a good wife and mother. So married women would only work when your husband couldn't support the family by himself. But of course, they're all paid so little that was very frequent. Well, what if you had a baby, right? What if you had a newborn? What do you do with the baby? Well, you can either pay for a wet nurse, and gosh, who can do that? A wet nurse is someone who is still nursing. So you'd pay someone else to nurse your baby and watch him. Or you bring the baby with you and you just keep them drugged. You give them a little bit of opium or whiskey to keep them quiet and complacent. Children were expected to contribute to the family, right? They will work in textile mills and mines, often working 14 to 16 hours a day, and would be beaten if they made mistakes or fell asleep. Mine operators used kids to pull coal carts through small areas. Over time, we start to see changes in society. We start to see people advocating for change, this desire for sufficient wages for factory workers so they could live full, comfortable lives. This serves as an example of Western government's expansion of economic and social regulations, right? Think about the laws that we talked about last lecture that limited children in the workforce. We see that social status is going to be determined by wealth rather than social class. So that means if you are born poor, but you work your way up and you can become rich, welcome to the upper class, as opposed to, sure, you're rich, but it's not like you were born into nobility, so you'll never truly be one of us. The industrial cities will lead to lots of rural to urban migration. We see a population increase in the mid-18th century predominantly. We see an end to some of epidemic diseases, improved diets thanks to potatoes. We see infant mortality rates decreasing, a higher birth rate, a lower death rate. And in the 1880s, Louis Pasteur is going to come out with germ theory. And around shortly after, you will have Joseph Lister coming out with his hygiene theory, which says, you should wash your hands. Still, it's a hard time if you're poor. You have what's known as the Hungry 40s, which is going to include the Irish potato famine, the rising price of food in the UK, and lowering wages will lead to serious social problems. Unemployment, alcoholism, child abandonment, prostitution. In general, we see that the middle class will benefit the most from the Industrial Revolution. Middle class women participated in something known as the cult of domesticity. So women were essentially taken out of the public sphere, right? The idea was women would be working in the home and would be responsible for home and family. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, when it was much more of an agrarian economy, you had much more mixing of men and women in the working sphere, right? You're both working on your farm. You're both taking your goods to market. You're both doing the shopping and the selling. Now, very much men would work and women would stay home. That's the idea of the cult of domesticity, is that it is the man's duty to work. And it is the woman's duty to be responsible for the home and the family. So, this is going to be some of the sort of Victorian ideals that emerge, these sort of separate spheres, that men belong in the public sphere and women belong in the private sphere. Not everyone agrees with this. Mary Wollstonecraft is essentially one of our first feminists, and she is in opposition to this idea. She is going to say that women have so much more to argue and shouldn't be relegated to just the home, just motherhood. In general, though, the middle class will attribute their success and their comfort to efforts, virtue, hard work. It's this idea that will become known as social Darwinism. We'll talk about it a lot more next unit. But essentially, Darwinism is all about, right, survival of the fittest. Social Darwinism says if you're rich, it's because you deserve to be rich. If you're poor, it's because you deserve to be poor. If you worked hard, you would be in the same position I am. So this idea in the middle class of they deserve their wealth and comfort. And if you're poor or your life is hard, that's somehow your own fault. If you worked harder, if you put in a little bit more effort, you too would be able to break free of your misery. Please watch this video on Mary Wollstonecraft. She is one of the women the AP wants you to know for this time period. All right. We see some cultural changes as well. We have the emergence of a white-collar labor force. So you have blue-collar laborers. Think about wearing like a blue sort of jumpsuit. You're working in a factory. Then you have white-collar workers. These are people who might be wearing a suit. They aren't super rich, but they aren't working in a factory either. These would be secretaries, clerks, salespeople. Some of these roles would be filled by unmarried women. And so while we have the cult of domesticity emerging, if you're part of sort of this white-collar, lower middle-class workforce, as an unmarried woman, there's a very good chance you might work outside the home. We start to see the emergence of advertising industry, promoting new products and the growth of sort of this consumerism. We start to see things like product crazes, like, ooh, the bicycle, so exciting. And the fact is, higher wages lead to increased spending. Again, I want to emphasize that this is primarily within the middle class and the wealthy. So with increased wages, with increased spending, with increased rest, right, you have the emergence of mass leisure culture. And this really shows growing secularism, right? So much less of your life is revolving around religion. So in the 1880s, you have like this bicycle fad. You have people starting to take vacations just as a brand new concept. You have the emergence of theaters, of comedy routines, of entertainment that you would just go and spend money to watch someone sing. Before, that was something that only the very wealthy could do, right? Only the wealthy could go see an opera. Who has the money just to go and sit for a couple hours and listen to music? Well, the middle class does now. So you have the emergence of these entertainment venues and thus a whole sort of entertainment industry. You have the emergence of team sports, soccer, football, baseball. Right? Our first Olympic Games are modern Olympic Games are in 1896. So, what were the economic effects of the Industrial Revolution, and what were some of the social effects of the Industrial Revolution? All right. I also want to talk about socialism and labor movements. So, I have talked a lot about how miserable it is to be a worker. Well, lots of people looked at that and didn't say, oh gosh, well, I guess this is what it is. We're doomed forever. People looked at that and said, no, this is wrong. We should make a change. And you have the emergence of these new ideologies that want to address the problems that have emerged in this new industrial era. One of these is socialism. Socialism is a political ideology that originated in 1830s Europe, which advocated for the government protection of workers from exploitation by property owners and government ownership of industries. So, socialism says that rather than having a full free market, the government should be involved in regulating certain industries. It might be energy production. It might be medicine. It might just be that they have lots of laws saying you must offer X amount of parental leave. You must offer at least this for retirement. You must give this much in time off, right? The idea is the free market will lead to the exploitation of workers. So it is the job of the government to step in and act as a mediating force, right? So socialism and laissez-faire are on opposite ends of the spectrum. This idea of socialism will lead to the founding of socialist and labor parties. Now, socialism and communism are not the same thing. So, Karl Marx. Karl Marx is a German journalist and philosopher who is going to live in England and really see the impact of industrialization on workers. He will collaborate with Friedrich Engels, and they will write this book called The Communist Manifesto. So he will be the founder of the Marxist branch of socialism. So if socialism is an umbrella, right, Marxism and what will emerge out of it being communism is under that umbrella. So they are not equal. So not all socialists are communists, but Marxism and thus eventually communism would fit under that socialist umbrella. Marx's main thesis is that it's all about class conflict. So he publishes the Communist Manifesto in 1848. This should be like ringing a bell for you, thinking about all those 1848 revolutions, right? This is the context in which he is writing. So he says in his book, history is a long series of conflicts between social classes, between the proletariat, the workers, and the bourgeoisie, the property owners. So businesses are getting larger and they are forming monopolies, and workers are suffering because of it. Eventually, this ongoing conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie will lead to a revolution and the eventual overthrow of the bourgeoisie. So it's all about class struggle. The group out of power, the proletariat who own no property, versus the group controlling the means of production, the bourgeoisie. If a new constitution granted individuals the right to private property, then the wealthy will own much more of it than the poor, right? So Marx is not in favor of any sort of private property, which is, of course, one of the main things that Adam Smith thinks government should do, right, is protect private property. So eventually the proletariat will get so fed up that they will want a revolution and full freedom will be achieved. This would lead to an end to all class struggle because all class systems would be eliminated. There would be no more private property. You would just have communal resources. So his theory will provide an intellectual framework for those dissatisfied with capitalism. Now, a couple things about communism and Marx's theory. First off, it's a theory. And like many things, it works great in theory, but in reality, it doesn't. The primary problem with the communist theory is that it relies on people to be selfless, right? It relies on people to take just what they need every time, never to take a little bit more, to give up what they have every time, right? To not save away a little bit extra of your income just to, put some away so then maybe your kid can have something nicer for their birthday. It relies on those in power making choices to reduce their own power and wealth and comfort every time, right? It's not like most of the time. Communism requires everyone to be making those communal sacrifices every single time. And humans are just inherently selfish, right? We like to be comfortable. And so from the get-go, whenever his theory is enacted on a national scale, we see that those in power, even if they have just recently risen to power, are not able or perhaps willing to make that sacrifice all the time. The other thing to understand about Marxism is that it is an intellectual theory. It's a philosophy, right? So that means there is, communism, which is a system of governance emerging out of Marxism. But then you also have things like a Marxist view of history. So a Marxist view of history is a system of interpretation of history. So you would look back at history and you'd say, look, it's all social, it's all class conflict, right? Let's go back to Moses, the Jews as slaves in Israel versus Pharaoh, right? They are the proletariat. They are the propertyless, and Pharaoh is the bourgeoisie. He owns the means of production, right? That's why you have that conflict. Any conflict in history, a Marxist historian would credit back to class conflict, to this uneven distribution of wealth. Okay, so we also see that socialism will rise up in continental Europe, and with it will rise labor unions. Labor unions are an organization of workers in a particular industry or trade created to defend the interests of members through strikes or negotiations with employers. They were originally formed to help each other in times of illness, unemployment, or disability. And they developed out of specific economic and social policy problems, right? What happens when you lose your arm working in the factory, and now you can no longer support your family. Well, if you're part of this union, they set money aside to help support your family. If everyone stopped working, then they can put pressure on the factory to provide better hours, to provide insurance. So governments wanted to make it illegal to strike, but that really disappears by the 1850s. What labor unions wanted primarily was better wages, safer working conditions, and insurance against illness, accidents, disability, and old age. So you start to see these labor unions participating in political systems, right? They start to get organized to get seats in governments to implement their goals. This works with our sort of new Europe with all of its constitutions. You see this especially with socialist politicians. So not every labor union is inherently socialist. One of the other political ideologies that will emerge during this time is anarchism. So an anarchist would be a revolutionary who wants to abolish all private property and government. And they usually want to do this by violence and replace it with just free associations of groups. So a couple things to mention. One, socialism is a word that gets thrown around a lot in our modern context. Now, most of us are actually in favor of some respect of some socialism, right? The fact that we have Medicare and Medicaid, so elderly people can have health insurance, or those with disabilities. The fact that we have a safety net, that we have food stamps, we say that's a good thing. Some people want to increase the government's safety net to include medicine, or they want more regulation of factories, or things like the government to pass a law that says all companies must offer maternity leave or parental leave. So you see many socialist governments around the world, right? Especially in Scandinavia and other parts of Europe. So it's important to understand socialism in this historical context and to try and separate sort of our modern political buzzword of socialism and think about it in its historical context. So please watch this video. It's really important that you watch this one because it helps explain the difference between socialism and communism. All right. This is something that I just want you to think about. What is your personal opinion about all of this? One of the things that is useful to remember is that with socialism, it does require, or in communism, it does require significantly higher taxes. This sounds great, in theory. Sure, I'm happy to pay higher taxes to make sure my neighbor doesn't die of cancer because they don't have health insurance, or to help ensure that the poor have enough to eat. But if your family is already struggling to make ends meet, if your family is struggling to pay rent, to put food on the table, to save for college, if you're thinking, man, the only way I'm going to go to college is if I get like straight A's through high school and manage to get a full ride scholarship, socialism could solve that, right? It could be free college education, but for everything you ask the government to do, that is going to be paid for through taxes, primarily. And that is one of the big arguments against it. It's easy to say in theory, this works great, but what does it mean when you are paying $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000 more in taxes, right? There's a reason why a lot of people are moving out of California to Arizona and Texas. it's because taxes are so significantly lower. And so your quality of life can be a lot better, more comfortable, I mean. And it means that because of those higher taxes, it's really difficult if you are in a lower paying job to make ends meet in California, in San Francisco, right? Now, you might be saying, well, the problem is our entire system. It needs to be reworked. But capitalism has its huge problems. I do not deny that. However, socialism and communism are not the automatic utopian solutions either. Any system that involves humans is going to have problems with it. And there are valid arguments in favor of a socialist government as well as a capitalist economic system. I want you to carefully parse through the arguments for each in your own head. All right, if you haven't watched this yet, please make sure you do so. Let's do a few practice questions. As a result of industrialization, the relationship between the Western world and the non-Western world single women and married women both did factory work, but for different reasons. Industrial work had an enormous effect on the family because So, for your summary, please explain how industrialization caused change in existing social hierarchies and standard of living. One last comment about socialism and capitalism. In class, you will be looking at the sources. When in doubt, go straight to the source material. So in class, we will be looking at some of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, as well as some passages out of Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto. Analyzing those documents and the specific words of the authors themselves is really helpful. We don't want to only rely on secondary sources for our understanding of ideas and ideologies. If you have any questions, please ask. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.